Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya Muhammad wa ala ahli baytihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. All right, I'm really excited for this session, and inshallah it'll become something very useful for all of you. The idea is to inshallah expose you to different careers. A lot of you are at that stage or soon will be at a stage where you have to make decisions. Probably you've already been bombarded by questions since you were like 6 years old by uncles and aunties and grandparents. What are you going to be when you grow up? What do you want to do when you grow up? And oftentimes you feel pressured that you have to have an answer. Um, and it's difficult. It's not so straightforward. You don't necessarily know when you're going through school and growing up what you want to do. You haven't been exposed yet to so many possibilities. And oftentimes what happens in our communities, we're only exposed to very few careers. So, probably many of us know doctors, many of us know engineers, many of us know IT people, and maybe that's about it. Like that tends to be maybe, 70, 80% of the adults that we know around us maybe have these few careers. But there are so many different things out there. And it's very likely if you're exposed to more things, there's a greater likelihood that you'll find something that you are better skilled for or have more interest in or maybe more useful, may do more good. So there's so many different factors to think about. So what I want to do is, inshallah, invite various individuals, my friends mainly, who are outstanding in their Islamic practice, also outstanding in some career path. I've filtered out those paths that I just mentioned, so no medical paths, no engineering, no IT, not because those are not worthy or good jobs, but you already have plenty of sample for those kinds of careers. So I'm going to try to expose you to some other careers. And really, it's going to be a fun conversation for me as well, because I like talking to people about these kinds of things and finding out about what they do and how they think and all of that. So inshallah, that's the goal. Attend as much as you can. I'm going to record the sessions, and then I'll edit it a little bit and put it on a YouTube channel so that other people can also benefit from it. If you're not able to make it, that's okay. I would prefer, I don't pick and choose and say, well, I'm not interested in this career, so let me not attend. Just as an education, be exposed to these different things. I have one person on the list. He's a comic writer, a comedian, right? We have a Shi'i comedian, and that's very interesting. Maybe that's that's not your career path or even a possibility for your career path, but it's interesting to see what kind of a career this is, what are the challenges he faces, and what kind of a personality does he have. And he is one of our community members in the US, so it's good to know who he is and what he does. All right. For today, I've asked Sayyid Sulayman to come on and not so much to talk about his, quote unquote career path, but to give us guidance and kind of, maybe give us some standards of what we should be thinking about as we think about career. So oftentimes, how successful you are in career determines how successful you are as a person in people's conception. So if you're successful in your career, then you're a good person. If you failed in your career or you're mediocre in your career, then you're not a very successful person. So we want to think about success. What is real success, and is it tied to career or not? Maybe what kinds of careers are halal? And sometimes we go into a career because someone mentioned it, or we were exposed to someone, and we just make decisions and start getting educated, and then we end up in a career that may be fully haram or has many haram components, and we never realized until we finally get in the situation, and now we've already invested so much time and money that if we feel like we can't make a decision to go backwards. So it's good to make these to think about these things ahead of time so that you can make good decisions. Another, I think, important question is, between men and women, is there a difference between how we should think about career? What's common between the two? What's different between the two? So I'm going to turn it over to Sayyid Sulayman to talk for a bit, and then I have some questions. Hopefully you'll also have some questions, and then maybe 15, 20 minutes in, whenever you feel like you've said some of the ideas that you want to say, then we can open it up to questions and We'll have to figure out, I think, how it works. Either you can put your hand up if you have a question, or we'll make it a little bit more organic and you can just kind of unmute yourself and talk once we open up for discussion, inshallah. Please say Sulayman.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I just want to check before I start talking if you can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, good. So I'm not going to address all of the points that you raised. I think they're excellent points and we can talk about them through the course of today's session. But just one point to begin, which is that we as Muslims need to be very deliberate about understanding what it is that grounds our sense of self, our identity, what we consider to be who we are. And what are the factors that determine what makes me who I am? And there's a number of things that come from our society, from our culture, that people generally use to think of themselves and define their own being. We're all familiar with questions of gender and sexuality. Is that something that determines who I am, or is it a fundamental part of my identity? And that's a separate question. We might talk a little bit about that tangentially, but more fundamentally, people generally think of their sense of self as being related to their current state, whether it be, who they're sexually attracted to, whether it be their emotions, whether it be their friends, their likes and dislikes, those types of factors are a big part of who I am. And that's natural in an individualistic society. In a secular society, for these factors to be front and center. As a Muslim, however, who I am is not primarily about what I may or may not be attracted to, whether we're talking about sexual attraction or even aesthetic or intellectual or emotional forms of attraction. That's not an important part of who I am. What I feel is not the primary factor that determines my identity or who I am. And my actions, my hobbies, my interests, what I do when I want to relax, that is not a primary determinant of who I am. So for example, if I'm, a football fanatic, or, I have a hobby or a sport or something that I'm really into, for many people that defines their friendships and their life and their identity. For a Muslim, the most important thing is a knowledge of our origin and our destination. And of course, the origin and the destination are both the same, because inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We belong to God and we originate, our existence comes from God's gift to us, and therefore we are marching back to our creator and our origin. So that's the constituent element of our identity and our sense of self. And what follows from that is that the most important thing to determine how I define myself is not anything that comes from within me, my feelings, my thinking, even my interests, but rather that which comes from God. And we'll talk about how that doesn't mean you ignore your feelings and your talents and your likes and dislikes, because all of us have a different emotional makeup. All of us have a different personality. And that personality is also a gift from God. So if I'm athletic, well, that's one of the gifts that God has given me. And if I'm not athletic, but I'm very intellectual, or I have a good voice, or I have a very good um, 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 mathematical sense, well, those are gifts that God has given me. But it's indirect. In other words, my interest and my talent doesn't define me. My attraction or my non-attraction doesn't define me. And even my actions in the fundamental analysis, they don't define me. But rather, all of these things are subject to evaluation. I have to think about my interests. Are they good? Or do I need to maybe become interested in something that I find as boring as can be because it's important? Am I the kind of person who gets bored really easily when I shouldn't? So I question even my interests. I question my hobbies. I question my talents and my skills and abilities in the sense of saying, how does God want me to use this? If he gave me this experience or this ability, how can I best utilize this to honor God? Maybe I'm very athletic, but it doesn't mean that I spend all my time in sports. Maybe I use my physical strength and stamina in some other way that might not directly be related to sports, but that is more beneficial and useful as a servant of God. So that's kind of the key question. And I wanted to give that as an introduction because men and women are often told when they enter school or college that your career is a big part of who you are. So do something that you love, because you're going to spend 8 hours at least a day in your working life at your career. Or make sure that you have a career at a more fundamental level, because if you're smart and you have so many talents, why would you waste your life by not going to college, or waste your life by not having a career? And I'm in favor of people going to college, and I'm in favor of people having a career, but not in that sense. Not in the sense that if you decide not to, then you're wasting a resource God has given you. Maybe there's a better use of my resources than going to college or than having a career. It's certainly important, it has a place, but we have to take it out of that central point, that focal point, and say you're throwing away something if you don't have a career. And then the second part of that, of course, is a career that can earn you a lot of money and power. But some people, even in a secular society, they will admire a career that's fulfilling and that you love, even if it's not going to make you rich. But what they might not appreciate is, well, even doing what you love from a Muslim perspective is not the highest aspiration, because we are to serve God, and that's our purpose. And because it's the month of Rajab and the month of Imam Ali, of course, the best illustration of that we can give is the verse of Quran revealed about Imam Ali. In Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 207, if I'm not mistaken, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَشْرِي نَفْسَهُ ابْتِغَاءَ مَرْضَاتِ اللَّهِ, describing Imam Ali and his willingness to sacrifice himself to save the life of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa among the people are those who sell themselves seeking the pleasure of Allah, not the pleasure of myself, not because I deserve to have fun. I want to fulfill my bucket list, my interests. I want to do what I love. But in the first instance, what does God want? What does Islam need? What does God need from me? And that's my priority. So that was just an introductory reminder that we want to shift the focus from the self to God. And of course, because God is the one who created ourself, we're going to value ourself. We're going to value ourselves much more than a person who doesn't believe in God, or that doesn't believe in a divine purpose, can ever value themselves, because myself is a divine trust. That's why we don't believe a person has a right to do whatever they want with their body. It's not my body, it's God's body. So we're going to honor ourself, our body, our mind, our emotions very highly, but not because they're mine, because they're God's. And I owe it to God to take the best care of what's his. Right? If I have my own car, I can treat it the way I want, I can abuse it. But if I'm borrowing your car, then I better make sure that I'm taking even better care of it than my property, because it's a trust from you. And a non-Muslim, or a non-believer, I should say, considers their body to be their property. They can abuse it or do whatever they want. But a Muslim considers our body and our mind and everything that we have to be God's property, and so we can never abuse it. And that's what I mean when I say that we honor it more than a non-believer, but not because it's important in and of itself, because it comes from God. So I'm done with the introductory remarks.
Was that, so it seems like that's mainly a negative message, kind of pulling us away from making our identity these sorts of things, and career is one of those things that oftentimes people do make as their identity, and you're saying that shouldn't be your identity. So you've given us some like a fundamental sense of what our identity should be,
and where it should come from.
Where it should come from.
So I think it should have a negative component, meaning where we're not going to be influenced by that secular culture. And I'm using secular just as catch-all for anything that is not in accordance with our Islamic ideals. So it might be, a culture that's seeped into people who follow a religion or believe in God, but it's not a God-centric culture. But I think it has a positive component as well, because it motivates us. And that's something that a lot of people, when you realize that the world is a rat race, and you realize that, it's not worth competing to be number one, to be the richest, to be valedictorian, or, whatever it might be, that you kind of are like, well, whatever, in the grand scheme of things, who cares if you were first in your class or not? And I think it should have a positive component as well, because in this world, if I believe in God, and I believe that I belong to God, and this world belongs to God, then I do want to be number one. Not because of my ego, but because I do want the resources that God has created for humanity, and for them to be used according to the wisdom of God. I want them to be under the control of those who do believe in God and will use them right. So it's also a positive message. I do want there to be Muslim billionaires, because a Muslim billionaire is not going to just buy, if they're truly Muslim, they're not going to buy, a collection of Rolls Royces and private planes and 20,000 square foot houses and castles and whatever. And that's what the Quran describes in Surah Al-Hajj. الَّذِينَ إِن مَّكَّنَّاهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. The believers are those that if God gives them power and strength, then what are they going to do? Well, that's going to be different from what everybody else does. Believers will أَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتَوُا الزَّكَاةَ. Our concern is going to be prayer and charity, and وَأَمَرُوا بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَنَهَوْا عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ, establishing what is good, eliminating evil and injustice from society. So it's a positive message too. It's not just that, well, college, is for people who believe in this world. Just do good enough that you can make a living. Who cares if you're head of department, or who cares if you're top of your field, or who cares if you're the highest earning person in your field? Yes, get out of the rat race as a rat race and as an ego trip. But as a Muslim, I do want Muslims and people of piety to have authority, to be able to have control of resources, so they use them for the greater good. They use them in accordance with God's command rather than against God's command. It's not a message of, life is too short, so don't worry about school and grades and professional advancement and so on. But it's certainly a message against careerism.
How do you balance that if we're living amongst people who do have those kinds of priorities? So if we're in school and we're all going for top grades, or a resume that's properly padded and properly that shows very good stuff to our university, or or to a recruiter for a job, how can we compete? Because some of that competition requires single-mindedly devoting yourself to the career kind of elements. And maybe, I don't know about in school, even in school, I think that does happen, but in careers, maybe it's even more clear, where a person who can, for instance, who doesn't have a family to worry about, or doesn't really care much about the family and prioritizes work, they might be able to spend, I don't know, 10 hours, 12 hours working in the day, because they don't have to worry about family, or they don't have to worry about community or other obligations. So they can put a lot more effort and time into developing themselves, accomplishing things in the work area. And then the Muslim has so many other obligations. They can't put the time in at the very minimum to be able to compete with that. So then how can we expect to be excellent in comparing apples to apples when we're living in a totally different world?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's a difficult balance. It's a lifelong struggle. It's one thing that I think the Quran mentions, that one of the attributes of the believers and the people who will be eventually empowered by God is that they are mustad'af. They are deemed weak. And one of the reasons why I believe they are deemed weak is not because they are actually weak, but because even if they are strong, because they have those same priorities that Sheikh Rizwan that you're mentioning, society will always say, well, Imam Ali, even if he has all the money in the world and all the soldiers in the world, he's not going to cut corners. He's not going to lie, cheat, and steal. We can still beat him because we don't have any restrictions, and he's got one hand tied behind his back. And he did have a hand tied behind his back. Imam Ali said, hey, don't think I couldn't have beaten Muawiyah, but I'm not going to stoop to his level. And I'm not going to win a game that's not worth playing. So in that sense, we are meant to be mustad'af, and I don't think we need to worry too much about that part. But there is another difficulty, which is, how can I want to be the richest person and not be egotistical? Because a lot of the things that are going to allow me to be the top of my field, are competitiveness, a little bit of being willing to elbow somebody out, for that seat on the in the internship, and polishing my resume, perhaps, and those are the general ways that people often get ahead. How can I do that and say, but I don't want to do it to serve my ego and in a way that compromises my values, keep myself separate? So there's a hadith that we have, which I think can help shed light on it. And this is hadith from Imam Ali alayhi salam. He said that we asked the Prophet, and perhaps Imam Ali himself was the one who asked the Prophet, that sometimes a person will fast and pray, and then shaitan comes to the person and says, you're just showing off. I mean, because I'll be honest, if I give a speech and you tell me that it was a great speech and it changed your life, I'm going to be like, yeah, of course, great. And if you tell me I read the Quran really beautifully, or if I hear you praising me that, that gave something in charity, or I did a good deed, it's going to make me feel good about myself. And so shaitan comes to the person and says, innaka mura, you are a show off. So what do we do? Now, you can eventually, inshallah, reach that place where if everybody says, what a wonderful worshiper you are, and if people come and say, you're the worst person in the world, it makes no difference to you. And that's a higher spiritual state. That is what we want to get to. Where if you come and condemn me for praying versus if you come and praise me for praying, makes no difference to me. Because I'm not doing it for you and I don't care what you say. But frankly, that's not really easy, and it's probably not going to be possible for most of us throughout our lives. We'll aspire to it, we're probably not going to get there. So the Prophet gave a little a method to use. He says that when that happens, then say to Allah, "A'udhu bika an ushrika bika shay'an wa ana a'lam, wa astaghfiruka lima la a'lam." Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you that I should do something for somebody else deliberately. And I seek your forgiveness for that which I don't know and I don't control. That pleasure that comes to me when you praise me for doing a good deed, it's not really in my control. But I'm going to do everything in my power deliberately not to do my prayer to impress you. When you get impressed, it's going to make me feel good, and that's not right. But then I say that, God, you help me with that. Astaghfiruka lima la a'lam. The same thing, when I'm earning more than you, I feel like, all right, I got ahead. I got the promotion. I got the higher income. I'm president or whatever. So the first lesson that we learn from the comparison with that hadith is, I have to consciously try not to do it for God, for other than God. And unconsciously, if it does kind of make me feel better, then, well, I seek forgiveness. And that's one reason why Prophet Muhammad ﷺ used to seek forgiveness so much throughout his day. According to some narrations, 70 times a day. He never committed a sin. He wasn't seeking forgiveness from a sin, but he was seeking forgiveness from just the nature of living in society. You're seeing and being influenced by so many things that are a distraction from living for God. So that's one part. And the other part is that, rather than fleeing from doing good because I want to be humble, let me go and do good and then develop the strength to stay humble. So Hajj, who goes for Hajj? I don't know, how much Hajj costs now, but it probably costs something like 12,000 a year, right, for one Hajj trip. That's a lot of money. And if you're a couple and you want to go on Hajj, $24,000-$25,000 is not something that a lot of people can afford. But those people who can afford it are actually the ones who need to go, because they're the kinds of people who are probably earning more than others, and they're in a position to maybe be arrogant. If I am earning average income, I'm somebody's employee, and I could get fired, for not doing my job. That's very different than if I am the employer and I get to fire people when I don't like their work. Right? Both people can be arrogant. A poor person can be arrogant. A rich person can be arrogant. But there's a lot more temptation for the employer to become arrogant. There's a lot more factors in their life that are pushing them to be arrogant. And so that person needs more protection against arrogance. Both of them need protection, but the one who has more factors making them arrogant is the one who needs more protection. So it's not like people who can afford to go to Hajj have an unfair advantage. They're the ones who need to go more than anybody else. You could think of it as a disadvantage that the Hajj compensates for. not that they're able to get closer to God than poor people. Does that make sense? So that's a general principle we can use as well. A lot of people, because they don't want to be arrogant, they don't want to show off, they don't want to feel like they're in the rat race, they pull back. Whereas maybe a healthier thing is to say, no, go forward and develop the humility. Be strong enough that you can beat up whoever you want and never even think of beating anybody up. Be the smartest person in the room, but don't be the smart aleck. Be the richest person in the room, but be the most humble and generous. And that's, I think, a better reflection of Islamic ethics. I don't know if that fully answers the question. I mean, it's a difficult, lifelong struggle, but I think those are some things that can help us in that journey.
So you all also just jump in. If you want to push back on anything, if you have further questions, then feel free to do that. You don't need to worry about raising your hand or anything. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and you can speak up. Let me pause for a second and give you a chance if there's anything so far, either related to what he said so far, or if you have some a new question, new idea that you want to ask.
So are we going to talk about the guidelines of how we're going to identify what careers are halal and what careers are haram? Like, are we going to have a rubric on what careers are halal? Are we going to move on to that, or?
Yeah, please.
Yes.
Sure. Well, I guess it depends on what you're asking about. I mean, there's certain things that are laws, right? Like Islam says, for example, that we are not allowed to profit from alcohol, from pork, from interest, from gambling, and certain specific transactions and careers are off limits to us. And that's a relatively straightforward question. It's just a matter of law. But then I think there are other questions that are more about what's better and what's not, right? There are certain jobs that mean that we're going to be dealing with the worst attributes of humanity. And now, again, if that's what's needed in society, right? You need somebody to become a soldier. Well, a soldier deals with stressful situations. They might have PTSD. They might have trauma from working to defend the country. If that's what's needed for defense of Islam, for defense of Muslims, for defense of people's dignity, then I do it even if it has the harms. But aside from what's needed, if I have a choice, I have two paths in front of me and both of them are needed, both of them are good. I think the key question is, which are the ones that are going to help me be a better person? Now, this could potentially lead people to choose some of the stereotypical careers associated with with Muslims or with immigrants, like medicine, for example. And I'll just use medicine as an example, not to limit career choices. But if there are two career paths and one allows me to help people heal and to give them comfort, consolation, support at a vulnerable time, well, that's better than another career that might give me just as much influence, just as much income, but it's not really as fundamental to the betterment of society. And of course, there might be a career that has a great deal of excitement, maybe even a high income, but the nature of the work or the environment around that job is one that is not going to be harmonious with my Islamic values. Well, then that's something that, all else being equal, I should not prioritize. And that's, I think, the most important factor in choosing a career.
Can you give an example of that last thing you talked about?
So some careers, for example, a lot of the socialization and maybe the Career advancement is, say in bars with alcohol, talking yourself up, no. There are certainly ways that we can preserve our values, but we're going to have to work harder to undo the damage of living a professional life that is completely defined by non-Islamic values. And at least I should be aware of that and then factor that in choosing the career. Or for example, there are some careers where the way that I'm going to earn money is by nickeling and diming people. And there are some studies that indicate that, for example,
Which means what, trying to get every last penny out of them? Is that what you mean?
yeah, trying to get every last penny. That's how I earn my income. Is the fine print of a contract. If it's halal, that's great. It might be a lot of money, but what kind of person is that going to make me? When my profit comes from people's personal tragedies and having to sell their house or their car at a bargain basement price because they lost their job. That's going to affect the kind of person I am if that's how I'm earning my profit, even if I'm doing it halal, even if I'm giving khums and giving charity. So
the Islamic ideal, on the other hand, is what, like, try to charge less of people and pay more and give discounts
exactly, that's
to
the Islamic
believers.
ideal that we have, is to try not to maximize our earning, to think of commerce and transactions as a way to seek God's blessings, and not to just have a calculator as an economist or an accountant might maximize my dollar earnings. Now, practically speaking, if you want to be successful in many careers, you need to do those things. But if I have my eyes open and I know what my Islamic ideal is, I might choose my careers differently, and I might structure my studying and my work in a different way. And another example that I think people have in a lot of careers is this mentality of work hard, play hard. And this is in a lot of different careers. Maybe some of these tech companies and some of these popular places to work. Forget your family, just live at the office, give it your all, and then when you go on vacation, then you're partying and you're playing really hard, and those two go together, because as Imam Ali says, a person who is foolish will always be on one extreme or another. When they're partying, they're going to party really hard, and then they're going to be, when they're working, they're just all work. And those are not just un-Islamic, but for your body, for your soul, those are not healthy ways to live. Islam tells us, even in our worship, don't even binge on Quran. Don't even binge on prayer. So if God doesn't want us to binge read Quran and binge pray, he certainly doesn't want us to binge on Netflix, or whatever other fun or work or whatever else people do. We want to inni uhibbu an aqdama ala Allahi wa amali mustawin. In the words of, I believe, Imam Zain al-Abidin, I want to come to God when my actions are consistent, and Islam wants consistency. Play a little bit every day, relax a little bit every day, work a little bit every day, worship a little bit every day. That's the Islamic ideal. So, like, these are some of those factors that would enter into your rubric. That not only what is halal and haram, that's the easy part. Interest is haram, gambling is haram. But how is that kind of a work environment? How is the way that I'm going to be paid going to influence what I start to value? Because eventually, if I'm paid for something, I'm going to start to value it. And if something is not paid, then I'm not going to value it as much. And if I can align those with my values, then I'm not getting myself filthy every day and having to take a bath. Figuratively speaking.
Even the first question, the halal haram question, what are resources that, or how can they think about those things? Because sometimes it seems a little complicated. So we say interest is haram, but then we have workarounds for using interest to buy things. Interest is haram, but so does that mean I'll make a job in a bank is out of the question? Job in finance is out of the question. If I'm an accountant who's keeping track of people's, like a bookkeeper who's keeping track of people's interest earnings, it's like it's not always as straightforward as saying anything that's interest, has anything to do with interest is automatically haram. So how can they further understand that?
Yeah, that is. So I said that's the easy part. You're right. It's not straightforward and it's not easy. What I meant by that's the easy part is that's kind of off your shoulders, meaning you do taqleed and you go to a qualified expert and say, okay, what are the workarounds that work? Is there a workaround, for example, with pork or not? Is there a workaround with alcohol or not? Is there a workaround with interest or not? I'm not saying that there are workarounds for some of these, but there are different. We live in an economic system that is not Islamic. And our jurists and our scholars recognize that Muslims have economic interests and needs that have to accommodate an imperfect world. And so different scholars, for example, with interest, have given certain workarounds where they say, well, this is okay, but there is no workaround for this. You cannot do this. Right? For example, almost all of our scholars say you can't sell alcohol, period. If your restaurant is not going to work without alcohol, then close that restaurant and start another business because you can't sell alcohol. There's no workaround for it. But with interest, there are certain workarounds. So what I would say is, whatever fields you're interested in, look at the rulings and the questions that are answered. They're not always going to be very detailed and perfect because careers are increasingly complex. But you'll generally now be able to find answers in English that speak about even careers in art, for example, or in medicine, of course, and in law, that do address questions. I've seen, Sayyid Sistani, for example, and other maraja. Can you work in politics? Can you work for, say, as a prosecutor or as a judge? Can you work as, in a non-Muslim bank and so on? So there are answers that are there, and it's easy in the sense that it's not your burden to make all the moral choices. You're doing taqleed and finding out what the red lines of Sharia are. But where I think the majority of our energy should be is within those red lines, even if there are some confusions about, exactly who I should follow and what the ruling is. If I give a lot of attention to what's within the red lines, how does the income work? How does the career advancement work? How am I going to be spending my time? What kind of people am I going to be working with? What kind of people am I going to be serving? What kind of effect am I going to have on society? Do I profit when everybody is, losing their house and losing their job? That's why potentially one reason why Islam says it's recommended not to sell coffins and shrouds as your business, because then when a lot of people die, you're like, all right, I'm going to earn a lot of money. Well, that's not a good place to be. And it's recommended not to be a butcher, for example, so you don't become hard-hearted. It's not recommended to avoid slaughtering an animal. In fact, there's places where it's wajib and places where it's highly recommended to slaughter an animal, but not to be a butcher. So I think that's where the majority of our focus needs to be. The way I'm going to earn my money, the kinds of people I'm going to be around, the kinds of things I need to do to advance my career, the kinds of people I'm going to be socializing around with. Are there conversations always going to be about money? Are there conversations always going to be about things that are going to make me a shallow human being? If so, again, doesn't mean that you have to avoid that career, but what am I going to put in place to make sure I don't become like them? And I can not just stay true to my values, but I can move forward in my values, strengthen and deepen my values. A lot of careers, they put us in a defensive position. I'm not as materialistic as the others. Whereas that's not what you guys should aspire to. Aspire to come out of your professional life, and if you have a career, a better believer, more firm in your values and more appreciative of why Islam tells us to value things other than career, salary, advancement, wealth, and so on as a measure of your humanity. And that applies, I think, equally to men and women. It applies equally, although it applies in different ways. Because for a man, you are responsible for your family. For a woman, you're not responsible financially for your family. But that's a different responsibility you have. In terms of values,
Can you
neither
just
men,
speak to that in more detail? So the difference between men and women, and how they should, maybe ideally, or how you recommend them thinking about career. Like
I mean,
society kind of wants everyone to be the same. What men and women should be the same. They should all have the same kinds of aspirations, and they can all do the same things. Islamically, is that the same ideal, or something? There's something different.
yeah, so I mean, the way I think about it is this. Society often tells us that, yeah, men and women are physically different. Men's sports are separate from women's sports. Men cannot bear children, women can. But we got to do everything we can to compensate for and kind of through laws, through policies, undo those differences. Whereas from an Islamic perspective, we believe that those differences are not a mistake God made. He accidentally made men physically a little bit different than women, and emotionally and physically different. What we believe is that God created men and women in his wisdom to together complete the needs of a human family and human society. And so we're not trying to compete. We're trying to complement and compete each other, not complete. Complete each other, not compete with each other. Right? And that's a key distinction. So we're equal in terms of our relationship to God. Man amila salihan min dhakarin aw untha. The Quran is very clear that you do good, man or woman, and if you are a believer, then you have your reward with God. You are equal. But how do I serve God? Well, if I am a man, then I may not want to work, right? Or, I may have my own personality preferences, but I have a responsibility that's been given to me by Islam. And that responsibility is to provide financially and physical protection for my family. It doesn't mean that I'm the boss of the family. Sometimes some of these non-Muslim, celebrities and people reacting to feminism and the excesses of feminism, they kind of have an anti-woman message, and that's not Islamic. It's not about being the boss. It's about fulfilling the role that God has given, which in reality is meant to protect and empower men and women both. Because when we fulfill the role that God has given us, then we are empowering the other partner to fulfill their role. We're enabling and facilitating them to fulfill their role. So what is the woman's responsibility? If you really are interested in a career or in work or in earning money, Islam has not said that there's any prohibition on that. But one of the goals and ideals that human society needs is for somebody to take care of the finer things in life. When you have physical protection, you have financial providing, you also need to convert that home, or that house, into a home. And that is something that God has uniquely facilitated for women. Now, a man might like to cook, might like to, take care of the kids, and that's fine. A woman might like to have a career, might like to work, that's fine. But we shouldn't forget that complementary role to complete, and not just necessarily to be redundant or to compete and have two career-oriented people who are equally career-oriented and then equally taking care of every other aspect of the family. Why? Because that generally means that some things are going to be valued more highly by society and they'll get a lot of attention in your family, and some things are not going to be valued highly in the family because they're not valued highly in society. And those are areas that a lot of families, they just lose sight of those things. So, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the value of together time as a family, the value of things that you do as a family, with home cooked meals, with spending quality time and forming real relationships with children, with grandparents, with uncles and aunts, with friends. Right? Those things are often marginalized in our society. So bottom line, Islam wants us to see men and women as not being in competition with each other. And each of us has been created for a primary role, and we should value that primary role, but we're not limited to that primary role. And the other thing I would say is that that always we should think about what we're going to want towards the end of our life. And there are certain things that we have to do now if we want the end of our life to be a certain way. So for example, I might not want kids now, and I might not want kids for the next 10 years. But do I want to have a close family and a big family towards the end of my life? Well, if I'm going to want that, then maybe I need to live my life a little bit differently now, in terms of where I go to college, how much debt I get into, how much I focus on career, what kind of career I focus on. Do I sacrifice marriage in order to have a career, or do I try to work on my education and my career while also giving importance to marriage? All of those things are going to have an effect on whether and when I will be able to have that family. And you can't predict what you're going to want in 20 years. But one of the best ways to predict what you're going to want in 20 years is to look at people who are 20 years older than you.
Yeah.
And what do they value and what do they regret? So learning from the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, learning from examples we have, looking forward. And there's a hadith from Ahlul Bayt that, you know how there's some people who are always trying to be younger? Like, they're 50, but they're trying to talk and dress and act like somebody who's 30. Those people are cursed by God. And then there's some people who are 30, but they're always looking to prepare for when they're going to be 50. They're looking ahead. Those people are blessed by God. And that's what's going to help you, because you can't predict what you're going to want in 30 years. But if you can look at women who are 30 years older than you, men who are 30 years older than you, you'll be in a much better position not to get caught up in the propaganda and spend your life chasing a dream that's going to be something you regret when it actually comes down to it.
Sakina, what's your question?
So I was wondering how you think we should strike that balance between work and family and community obligations. And Sheikh Razwan touched on it before, where a lot of people, like there's some people who don't have any family obligations or any community obligations, and they're able to get ahead really fast in their work life. But then a lot of Muslims, I think, especially Muslim women, have, I think just generally speaking, have more family obligations, and so they're not able to get as ahead in their work life. And so I was wondering, is there a way to get ahead in work, but also be caught up with family and community obligations?
You know, there's an image often given to us in the West that you can have it all. You know, you can hire somebody to clean your house, you can hire somebody to do your landscaping, you can hire somebody to take care of your kids, you can hire somebody to cook your meals, you know, and you can have it all. But the reality is you can't have it all. And if I'm hiring somebody to take care of my kids, they're not going to get taken care of as well as if I was taking care of them. And the same thing with my meals, and the same thing with everything else. So part of that is that we just have to recognize that that's an impossible standard. And then we have to start to think, what is it that I really value? What does it mean to get ahead? Am I really getting ahead? You know, sometimes, now I said earlier that we should want to have power and money to use it for the right purpose. But again, it's in order to serve God, not because the power and the money are important. So if a person is getting ahead in their career, they're earning more money, they're getting promoted and moving up in their company, but they're not serving God, or their kids are, you know, being raised by a nanny, or, you know, whatever the case might be. Are they getting ahead or are they getting behind? Maybe I should start thinking about that as actually moving behind and not think about it as moving ahead. Does that make sense? So we can't have it all. We have to prioritize. But what helps is if I don't think I have so many responsibilities: community, family, friends, career, self. I have one responsibility, right? Which is towards God. And then God tells me to honor my family in a certain context, to honor myself in a certain context, to honor, you know. So when I remember that I don't have multiple responsibilities, I only have one responsibility. And then through that one, I have to see where can I fit the different parts that God himself wants me to have. I think we can do it. We can develop a better balance, but never regret what people are doing. Don't think that somebody's getting ahead if they're not doing it in a balanced way, and if they're not doing it by prioritizing what God wants us to prioritize. I know we're almost out of time, but there was one question on the chat from Musa. Can I just quickly read that and address
Sure.
it?
Yep.
So how many degrees of separation can there be between our roles and the parts that are haram? Well, so if something is haram, then you know, there's no degrees of separation. We just can't do it. So investing in Lockheed Martin, the question that we would ask is it permissible to invest in companies that have halal earnings and haram earnings, for example? Are we allowed to invest in that company? Some maraji' might say yes, some maraji' might say no. So if it's haram, then you have an easy answer. If it's not, then the question becomes interesting, because then you want to say, let's say, assuming for the sake of argument, it's okay to invest in a company like Boeing or Lockheed Martin because some of their earnings are halal, right? They do civilian things. But do I want to invest in a company that the stock goes up when there's war? I might earn a lot of money, but how is that going to affect me? So the haram part, again, that's the easy part. You just ask the person who is an expert. But the more important question is, I have these investments and, you know, I wake up and I find out that my stocks are up because there was a new war that started. Well, I'm becoming a terrible person. And, you know, to the earlier question, I'm actually not getting ahead. I'm becoming less human. I'm going down in my humanity. I'm becoming more like an animal, maybe worse than an animal. And so don't think of it as getting ahead or getting profit. It's losing out.
Very good. Ahmed, let's have your question. This will be the last question for the session.
Yeah, so I remember Sheikh Sulayman, he said something earlier about Muslim billionaires and like how we should like give and stuff. So I was just wondering if one has a career path that might be where they get a lot of money, like big billions or like millions. Is it bad to have a little bit, like if you give a lot and you pay your khums and you do like whatever obligations you have to do Islamically and you also give charity? Is it bad to have like
A good car.
a couple cars or like, you know, like a nice house?
That's a very good question, and the short answer is no, it's not bad. In fact, that's part of the Quran, and it's a hadith of our fourth Imam, Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, that az-zuhdu fi ayatin fi kitabillah or min kitabillah, that true turning your back on the world is in a single verse of the Quran in Surah Al-Hadid. لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسَوْا عَلَى مَا فَاتَكُمْ وَلَا تَفْرَحُوا بِمَا آتَاكُمْ. Don't be sad if God takes something away from you. Don't be happy if God gives something to you. The point is not that you have a good house or a big house or good cars. The point is that what makes you happy? Is that what gives you your self-esteem? Do you prioritize buying that car over giving your obligations to Allah? When you drive up in a fancier car than your brother or your friend, does that make you feel like, look at me? Or does that not factor into your equation at all? Do you actually maybe want to say, hey, let me buy my brother an even better car so I can enjoy my luxury car, but he can enjoy an even better luxury car? So those are the kinds of considerations. Some of our imams, like Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam, dressed well, had good food, and so on. What would be luxuries by the standards of that time. But they shared and gave in charity and encouraged others to give in charity. And the fact that they had good houses, good cars, good food, good clothing, actually helped them be a model of pious living for the rich. So imagine if you're a billionaire and you drove a beat up used car. Well, your own family, your parents, your brothers and sisters, your society, they might make fun of you and they might move away from God. They might think religion is not for normal people, it's just for weirdos. So you might actually be able to do more good by having a big house and a luxury car. By not prioritizing the bling. Does that make sense? So Islam doesn't say that you cannot have good things, but good things should not be what give you your sense of self-esteem, and they should not be your priority, and they should never distract us from obeying God.
Ahsantum. Thank you all for participating. I get the sense, I think what I'd like to do is maybe a few weeks down the road, after we've talked to some other people, then maybe we'll get more of a sense, and it'd be good to revisit some of these ideas, and maybe we'll have maybe more questions and more things to think about after we've processed some of the other careers and what other people are saying. So I'm gonna keep that open. Maybe I'll talk to Sayyid Sulayman afterwards to see, maybe like a month or two down the road, if he comes back, and then we talk some more about these same ideas or further ideas. That would be something good.
Inshallah. I'm sorry if it was a little heavy. I'm not good at simplifying things, so I hope it made sense, and hopefully gave us all something to think about.
Inshallah. All right, Ahsant. Let's say one salawat and we'll close for today. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Waalaikum salam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sayyid. Thank you, Sheikh.